Hello YouTube, this is UMills03. We've made it to lesson 29 in the Java curriculum, and we're getting deeper into our discussion of object-oriented programming. So through lessons 22 through 24, we were taking a look at the object-oriented fundamentals, constructors, the toString method, the use of the keyword this. We talked about the difference between the static method, which is called on a class, and an instance method, which is called on a particular object, right, which is called on an example of a class. And so those are sort of the fundamentals. And then we talked about wrapper classes, and we said we want to understand wrapper classes because there's a special type of data structure called an array list, which only accepts objects. We couldn't put an int or a char into it, but we could put an integer or a character object into it. And so what we're going to be doing is talking about comments in this video, because as our programs get more complex, it's going to be helpful to understand what the methods do and to have really formal documentation. You know, if you go to work for a software engineering company like Google or Facebook and you write code, not only will you be expected to write the code, but if you ever switch companies, it's going to be helpful for you to have provided documentation and for you to make someone else aware of the methods and how they operate, just so that someone can kind of get into your footsteps and pick up where you left off. So we're going to talk about Javadocs. It's a formal type of documentation called Javadocs. And so what it is it's formal comments that you have for each of the methods and constructors in your class. So what I'm going to do, I'll show you an example here where Java already has provided some documentation. So this is for an ArrayList class, and we were looking at methods of the ArrayList class in the previous two videos. In lessons 27 and 28, we were talking about ArrayLists, and we formed an ArrayList of person objects at the end of lesson 28. So I would encourage you to go take a look at that if you haven't done so already. So this is the documentation for the ArrayList class, and you can see it's very specific and it's very detailed about what the array list is. So it's a resizable array implementation of the list interface. And it just goes on and on and on, right? And it talks about how these methods run in constant time, right? It's a basically that means it's a quick process. It's not exhausting for the program to figure out what the size of a list is or to retrieve an element. That all happens basically in one step. And so you would expect that from an array list, right? You'd like to be able to access elements from it pretty efficiently and retrieve elements and change elements. You'd like to be able to do that in like one step. So anyway, you can scroll down here, and what we can do is we can look at the documentation for one of these methods. And what we're going to be doing is providing similar documentation, not for the ArrayList class, but for the person class that we spent lessons 22 through 24 developing. So what we're going to do, let's look at, we were talking about ArrayList methods, right? So let's look at a simple one. Let's look at the size method. And so what you do is you can look at the documentation here, and this int here on the left means that it returns an int. So now if you double click on that link, you can see that these methods are, they have hyperlinks on them. So you just click size, and this is what the method header would look like. So, you know, some of these words are getting more familiar to us now, right? So public means that the method can be accessed from outside of the ArrayList class. And obviously that would be helpful, right? I mean, we've been calling the size method in our Hello World class. Like, we've been calling the size method on ArrayList objects far outside of the ArrayList class itself, right? So obviously you'd want a method like that to be public. And it returns an int, it returns an integer, and the name of the method is size. These parentheses are empty, which means that the method doesn't accept any inputs. You don't feed anything in when you want the size. You just call the size method on a list, and this is the number that it gives. And this is a short description, right? Because you don't want to say more than you have to. So it just says literally returns the number of elements in the list. So straightforward enough. And then there's another one right here. This is called documentation. And so it tells you what it returns. And then for any methods that have parameters, any methods that accept inputs, it would tell you that. So for example, let's take a look at the get method. Remember, what the get method does is it's an instance method. So you call it on a particular list. And if you feed in an index position, it returns the item at that index position. That's what this capital E means. It's just a general data type. So it's the data type that happens to be in your array list. So what you do is you would say .get, you'd say list.get of, and then you feed in a number. We saw this in the previous video, right? And then it just says returns the element at the specified position in the list. And so this is an example of documentation. And we can look at other examples too. So let's go to the API for the math class, right? We've seen this before. I think we were talking about this in lesson 19. And so we saw, this descriptive documentation, basic numeric operations such as exponential, logarithm, square root, and trigonometric. And then it has really formal and specific documentation. And it even has documentation for the constants. So if you click on the pi constant, it says the double value that is closer than any other to pi, the ratio of the circumference of a circle to its diameter. And so that would give you better precision than any other number that Java could provide of the value of pi. And so it's just descriptive, and you can figure out exactly what that method does. And that's a method, so that's not a method, that's just a field, right? It's just a constant. But, these are methods down here. Tangent, right? So tangent, obviously, a method like tangent has an input. You want the tangent of what? And this is a static method, right? So you wouldn't call tangent on a particular math object. The tangent is called on the math class. Remember in lesson 19, we didn't have to create a math object. We didn't say mathx equals new math. And then we didn't say system.out.println of x.tangent of 12. You could just say system.out.println of math.tangent of 12 because it's a static method. And so what you're going to have for documentation, what I want to draw your attention to is these two things right here. So obviously you're going to have a description, and then the parameters are in the returns. Okay, so we talked about methods that either have parameters or they don't have parameters. So some methods have inputs and others don't. When we were talking about static methods in lessons 20 and 21, we had an example of a method called U, and it just was returned a double. It just returned 5.0. But it didn't have any inputs into it. You just call U and it gives you that 5.0, which is totally fine. But this method has a parameter, so you have to input an angle, and so it really has a description of that parameter. So it says A is an angle in radians, and then returns, it says returns the tangent of the argument. So you want to be specific not only about what inputs are coming into the method, and if you have 8 inputs, you need to write and describe what the 8 inputs are, but also the returns. Does it return anything? Some methods do, and some methods don't. Methods that don't return anything are called void. They just accomplish a task. And the examples that we've seen, usually void methods are responsible for printing something, but they could do something even less than that. Maybe all they do is set a variable or something. So that's kind of what's going on here. And so this is example of documentation. And so we're going to be formulating documentation for our person class. And I want to show you what that looks like and how it would appear. But let's go ahead and do it for a simple static method first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my Hello World class. And we have some sandbox code from when we were talking about array lists in the previous video. So we can just ignore that for now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a very simple static method. It's going to return a Boolean, and we're going to say same length. And what it does is it's going to accept 2 string objects, and it's going to return true if and only if the 2 string objects have the same length. And so the simplest way to write that is you feed in these 2 strings, and you could say something like return a.length equals b.length, right? We said that if you have 2 equal signs, it's checking for equality. If you only have 1 equal sign, like up here, remember, look at up here, string array called terms is equal to this. So that's an assignment. But this is checking for equality down here. And so this is a method, and it's pretty straightforward. You would be able to see that it's a static method, so it runs on its own. You don't need to create a Hello World object. You don't need to create an instance of the Hello World class in order to use this method. You simply call it. You simply call the method on the actual class. So what you would do is you could say system.out.println of hello world.sameLength. So if it's a static method, you call it on the class. Another example of a static method that we've seen is integer.toString, right? And then integer.toString of something, right? It accepts an int and it returns the string representation of it. So since you're calling it on the integer class, the class itself, that's a static method. So here you have a static method, and we're just going to go ahead and try out an example. So we're going to say true and cars. Okay, so we would expect those 2 strings to have the same length. And so we should be getting T down here. And I'm just going to go ahead and delete some of this array list code, but you really should go watch the video on array lists if any of that stuff is unclear to you, right? And so obviously we could go ahead and compile this, and then we could run the main method. And obviously we see the true there because those are the same length. But then if we go ahead and concatenate this cars with dogs for something, I don't know why you'd say cars and dogs. I think I was thinking cats. But now if you concatenate, now you have a string of length 8, and then they're no longer the same length. So that's why the method returns false now. So with this example, we're going to make some documentation for it. So the way that you do a Javadoc, we've already talked about a multi-line comment. We said that a multi-line comment starts with a / and then you do this asterisk, this star, and then you just press enter and the rest is sort of done for you. And this is an example of a multi-line comment that's sitting on top of this method. But there's a specific type of multiple line comment called a Javadoc. And so what you're going to do for a Javadocs is you're going to have a / and then 2 stars like this. And so this comment is going to show up if you're talking about BlueJ, assuming that you guys have been doing your code in BlueJ, that IDE that we downloaded in lesson 0. In Javadocs, they show up in blue rather than gray. So you might remember that the regular comments show up in gray. But then if you're talking about formal documentation, then it shows up in the stark blue color. And so this is where you're going to make a description of the method. And so you're going to have basically just a brief description of what it does. So this method returns true if and only if the 2 input strings are the same length. And that would be an example of a brief description. You know, it's enough of a description that people understand what it does. And it's not so much of a description that people are wasting time reading words that they don't need to be reading. And so after you have a description of the method, what you're going to do is you're going to list any parameters that the method accepts. And so what you're going to do to signify to Java that you have a parameter is you're going to write @param. You're going to write @param. And then what you would do is you would just have the name of the parameter that you used for the method, right? So we said that this A and B, right? We said parameter names don't really matter as long as they're consistent. So if you call them A and B here in the method header, you need to call them A and B inside of the definition. If you call them X and Y, then call them X and Y inside of the definition. But for here, if you call it A, then you would write param A, the first string to check the length of or something. You could write something like that. And then param B, obviously something similar. So the second string to check the length of. And then what you would do is you would say return. So you would say @return. And then you would just say what the value that it returns. So again, it would just be, it might be something that's similar to the description. So you would just say true if A and B have the same length. You know, what is it that returns? So true if they have the same length, false otherwise. And so this is an example of documentation. This is a Javadoc comment for a method, and this would be a very high quality piece, you know, this would be very high quality documentation. So now what we're going to do is you can see up here on the top right, we have something that says source code, and this is the source code for our Hello World class. So now what you do is you go ahead and click on that drop down and you press documentation instead. And what's going to load is some documentation for your Hello World class. And it sort of looks official. It kind of looks like the websites that we've been loading up in Google to look at the classes that Java already provides us. And so, you know, we're going to have to do some more things here. Maybe I shouldn't have shown this quite yet, but we're going to have a description of the class up here. You know, you can see there were Javadocs. I don't know if you noticed this already, but this is Javadocs up here on top of the class. So let's go ahead and fill out a little description for the Hello World class. We should probably be doing this on person, but let's just do it here real quick. So this class is a sandbox for demonstrating Java concepts. And then what you would do is you would fill in your name. So I'm just going to put in a fake name here. I'm going to say Jake Campbell. And then I'm going to go ahead. I can put in today's date. So today's Friday the 13th, August in 2021. And so that would be perfectly valid documentation. And then usually, I don't know if main methods always have like documentation, but certainly your method, like the actual methods, right? Like the functions that you've written to help you, you know, complete tasks and get things done in an efficient way. These types of, you know, concrete substantive methods that add functionality to your code should have this documentation. And so now this is pretty good documentation, I would say, for a class. And so now if you go to the documentation, you have a constructor summary. So I don't know if I mentioned this already, but by default, all classes have a default constructor. So if you wanted to use an instance method of a particular class, we said that you need to create an instance of that class first. And then so what you would do, and you would just be basically calling the implicit constructor. So here you don't see a constructor, but you could say hello world x equals new hello world, okay? And you would just call the default constructor. There's no parameters that are passed in, but this is implied, and Java has no issue with this code. And so at that point, then again, if you make this a static method, it's not going to run on its own, right? Now you don't call same length on hello world, you would call it on X because it's an instance method now. So hopefully, again, that's another review, another explanation of the difference between a static and an instance method. Is it called on an instance or is it called on the class itself? And this is an example of an instance method as I just changed it. So now if you go to the documentation, you have that anyway, the constructor summary, and then you have a method summary. So we have a static void method called main. You know, every good class should probably have a main method. And then you have the same length method, and it says it's Boolean. And then so you can look at constructor detail and method detail here. And so, you know, you could look at method detail. So for same length, this is the documentation that shows up. So it says this method returns true if and only if the two input strings are the same length. This is exactly the description that we wrote. And then we have the parameters A and B, and you can see that it knows. So the A and B that we wrote, it kind of sections them off, and then it has this little dash, and then it says what a description of that parameter, and then a description of the return value. So we can go ahead and do this for one of the methods in our person class. I'm realizing this video is already getting kind of long, but let's do it for some of the methods here in our person class. So then if we go ahead and do this, so then you could have a description of a constructor. So what you would do now, let's go ahead and make some Javadocs for this constructor. So remember, you're going to do / and then you're going to do ***. And then what you would do is you would say this constructor creates a person object when a name is parameterized or provided. Okay, and so then what you would do is this method, what you could do is it doesn't really return anything. Okay, so you wouldn't have return for this one, but what you could do is you could say param name, the name of the person object to be created or something. And then if you really want to, you could say and assigns a default value for the age, okay, or something like that. But there's only one parameter, so you write, remember, just write @param and then the name of the parameter and then a quick description. And then if you go ahead and compile it and we go ahead and look at the documentation for this person class, a lot of this is not going to be filled out, but you could come back here. We've already written these methods, and you'd go ahead and tell people how the methods work and, you know, any parameters and return values. And then for this constructor here, the one that just accepts the name, now you have a description of it. And you could do the same thing. Let's do the same thing for a setter method. So now if you go ahead, let's do it for a setter method. So now this one, this set age method here, what you do the 2 asterisk, and you could say something like this method changes the value of the age instance variable or something like that. And it wouldn't return anything because it's a void method, but you would have a parameter. So you would say param x, the new age of the person object. Okay, and then same thing for get age. So then this one, we already have sort of a documentation here a little bit. So let's make it formal documentation by sticking on a star there. And you could say, you know, a getter method, get instance getter method maybe, which retrieves that object's age. So that would be fine. And then instead of putting param, you would just return age. So you could say return age, the age of the person object or something. And then that would go ahead and appear in the documentation. So now you go ahead and look at the documentation for the get age method. You go ahead and scroll down, you look at method detail, and it tells you returns age, the age of the person object, and then of course the description that you wrote for it. The last thing I want to tell you is that if you write Java documentation, it'll appear if you do a solo method call. So let me show you what I mean by that. So if we look at the hello world class, remember we have this method called same length, and I'm actually going to make it a static method again because I want to be able to just run it from outside of the class without creating an object. So I don't need to create this hello world object, but I'm just going to say system.out.println of same length. Or if you want to be formal, if you're outside of this class that it's defined in, you'd need to write hello world.sameLength. And so we can go ahead and run it, but I wanted to show you that this documentation is going to appear in a neat place. So now if you go ahead, instead of running the main method, if you call the same length method, this is kind of neat because now your documentation appears when you try using the method. So it tells you exactly how it works. And it says this method returns true if and only if the 2 input strings are the same length. And so now I would know exactly how it works. So now if I say rocks and socks, you know, it would be clear to the programmer that I'm expecting true here. But then if I go ahead and run it again with something different, how about the letter S and then Troy, and I go ahead and run that, I get false. So this is just why documentation is helpful, is because it shows up in your program and it's sort of attached to your source code and it makes it more understandable. It provides more context clues for a programmer. And it's just a reminder to have good, clean, formal documentation so that other engineers can understand your code and so that you yourself can understand your code if it's been a while since you've last looked at it. So that's just some notes on documentation. Hopefully this lesson wasn't too difficult. It's one of the easier ones to just understand basically how to write comments and where they appear. But you should be formal. You should, get comfortable doing that. And then we can talk in the next video. So from me, Mozo3, thanks for watching and please subscribe.